Hi class, my name is Tristan Thompson and I'll be presenting my leadership forum, specifically on the effects motivation has on student athletes and coaches in a collegiate cross-country running setting. Today we'll be talking about the introduction, background of problem and research questions, literature review, methodology, results and recommendations, and conclusion. Student athletes at the collegiate level are posed with two levels of motivation that can bring forth success. Yet depending on the correct method of approach can drastically affect their sport enjoyment and involvement. Motivation can single-handedly make or break a student athlete's performance and affect the chemistry of the team. As a coach, it is crucial to foster relationships with each student athlete to bring out the best behavior in each of them while optimizing their full potential. Holden et al. 2017. From a cross-country perspective, each student athlete plays a pivotal role in the success of the team, which is why finding the correct source of motivation is imperative for achieving peak performances both mentally and physically. This section will analyze the effectiveness motivation has on student athletes and their respected coaches. Furthermore, this section will analyze the major implications between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation within a cross-country running setting and analyze how coaches can better prepare their student athletes for competition. Background of problem. It is common for incoming freshmen at the collegiate level to not reach their full potential during their first year of college. Schilling and Hayashi, 2007. Of course, this is not true for every incoming freshman. However, the majority see their most difficult transition during their first season of collegiate cross-country. Many factors can be culprit of this problem, but the main source can be derived from the correct form of motivation and physiological response to training. The root of the problem lies within student athletes that are extrinsically motivated to run at the next level following the culmination of their senior year of high school. Weinberg et al. 2017. Many student athletes that are solely driven to earn an athletic scholarship find that once they obtain this, they find it challenging to find another purpose. This is a direct source of extrinsic motivation and can be looked through short-term lens rather than long-term because of the lack of sustenance. Perry et al. 2017. Extrinsic motivation can also be a hindrance to a student athlete's remaining portion of their collegiate career because of the requirement to maintain their peak performance in fear of losing their scholarship. When financial aspects are implemented, the livelihoods of student athletes, it can severely affect their training and impact their performance. When student athletes are intrinsically motivated for the love of free-spirited competition and the lifestyle that running has to offer, they can see significant increases in their performances. Zions, Xian, and John Wang, 2008. On any given day, poor practice or competition is bound to make its way to every student athlete. However, the ones that are intrinsically motivated will respond better than those that are extrinsically motivated because they can see the light at the end of the tunnel and can enjoy the sport for what it is. Maximizing potential must come from the coach representing positive behavior and the student athlete discovering their source of intrinsic motivation. Mahoney et al. 2013. Despite the performance of developing intrinsic motivation within the student athletes, coaches must foster a positive team environment to set their student athletes up for success to ease any unnecessary stress. Research questions. Question 1. Which type of motivation is more effective for student athletes reaching their peak performance in a cross-country running setting? This research question will explore the major differences between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation while highlighting the effectiveness the correct form of motivation can have on a student athlete. The type of motivation that is required for student athletes to reach their peak performance is intrinsic motivation compared to extrinsic motivation. Kahn et al. 2011. Many student athletes fall short from reaching their full potential because their motivation stems from external factors rather than internally. Research question number 2. How can coaches better prepare their student athletes for competition? Coaches serve as role models for their student athletes and can better prepare them by behaving in a positive manner. The demeanor of a coach can positively or negatively affect their student athletes, which is why coaches play a pivotal role in the success of a cross-country team. To better prepare student athletes, coaches must learn to properly assert positive behavior to mimic the importance of intrinsic motivation. Weinberg et al. 2017. When coaches show a positive attitude towards sport enjoyment and involvement, their student athletes are more inclined to match that same behavior. Literature review. The following slide will cover intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, analyze intrinsic motivation as a whole, and analyze extrinsic motivation as a whole. Intrinsic motivation can be associated with being process-driven, whereas extrinsic motivation involves being outcome-oriented. Philbay, 2017. Intrinsic motivation is a contributing factor for a sport experiences to be positive while aiding in persistence when challenges arise. Sacchetti et al. 2013. And lastly, extrinsic motivation stems from external factors that can influence an individual and relies solely on the outcome of performance. Ball et al. 2016. Learning more about the differences between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation will help identify the strengths and weaknesses associated with each type of motivation. Despite both forms of motivation having their strengths and weaknesses, it will be important to identify which one brings forth the most amount of team success. Intrinsic motivation derives solely from internal components as opposed to extrinsic motivation, which stems from external factors. This literature review will analyze the effects that intrinsic and extrinsic motivation have on student athletes and coaches within a cross-country running setting. This study will examine helpful coaching tactics to motivate and inspire student athletes to reach their full potential. In a culture where sports can come at the expense of the student athletes, it is imperative to conduct studies that educate the public about optimizing motivational levels. Intrinsic motivation. In the context of sport enjoyment, intrinsic motivation derives from a self-driven state of motivation. As stated previously, intrinsic motivation is a contributing factor for sport experiences to be positive while aiding in persistence when challenges arrive. Sacchetti et al. 2013. The sole function of intrinsic motivation comes from personal interest and does not rely on any external factors for enjoyment, which is why sport enjoyment can be empowering for student athletes. Sport enjoyment has a strong influence on the physical activity level of student athletes and how they go about their training. Perceived coaching behaviors. Coaching can be looked at as a reflection of oneself and to another individual and plays a pivotal role in a student athlete's motivation. Furthermore, the behavior and mannerisms that student athletes conduct themselves with can be influenced by their coach. Alamegro 2010. Based on a coach's personal orientation, their behavior can strongly impact their student athlete's performance and how they carry themselves. The self-determination theory, SDT, states that an emphasis on satisfying an individual's needs for success and autonomy will foster their intrinsic motivation, Philbay 2017. Knowing this about SDT, it is crucial for coaches to give their student athletes opportunities for autonomous moments for them to truly enjoy the sport at which they do best. Focuses on the process. When coaches and student athletes are self-driven, their focus can shift from being outcome-oriented to process-oriented. Focusing on the process is centered toward intrinsic motivation and displays true passion. When coaches focus their behavior towards a process-driven program, it can boost the commitment of their student athletes and sport participation. Sacchetti et al. 2013. To accommodate for the unique perspectives and personalities of each student athlete, it is important for coaches to optimize different coaching strategies to increase sport commitment. Extrinsic motivation, specifically performance orientation, which is extrinsic motivation stems from external factors that can influence an individual and relies solely on the outcome of performance. Student athletes that are extrinsically motivated can become positively stimulated to perform better during competition when a reward is at stake. Ball et al. 2016. Under extrinsic motivation, the performance of each student athlete can be based on their surroundings and does not always offer the most stable foundation for achieving success. For example, external factors like people, assignments, and physical rewards can positively or negatively affect a student athlete's performance because their motivation directly comes from these external sources. Control and power. The control and power that is directly connected to extrinsic motivation rests in the power of the coaching staff. The effects that a coaching staff have over their program can impact the culture of their respective program. According to the SDT model, coaches do not prioritize their student athlete's success through autonomy and are challenged when achieving positive results. Philbay 2017. When controlling and power are emphasized, it inhibits skill development and being a role model to student athletes. Focusing on the outcome. When student athletes are extrinsically motivated, their goals are often aligned with negative outcomes. The result of extrinsic goals would include their higher levels of emotional exhaustion and higher short-term satisfaction. Zhang et al. 2018. Upon the completion of extrinsic goals, the satisfaction to continue training becomes less motivating because their extrinsic goal is already accomplished. Despite the outward orientation for achieving extrinsic ambitions, student athletes can fall into a trap of a hedonic treadmill. Zhang et al. 2018. A hedonic treadmill is an extrinsic goal that is quickly set and accomplished in a short period for outward achievement. The goal of the research was to evaluate each student athlete and coach using anecdotal evidence to support the total population, which consisted of 11 females and 19 males, resulting in 30 total individuals. However, 28 only did the survey. Across the population of student athletes and coaches, there was an age range that varied on grade level to provide more diversity and inclusion to the research study. Participants were administered an online survey to reflect on their personal experiences within the sport of cross country, identify the source of all motivational levels, and elaborate on their racing strategies used for competition. To prevent unbiased results, an online survey was uploaded to Qualtrics and emailed to each participant. The advantages of using a survey were to provide an open-ended answer for student athletes and coaches to rate their perceived levels of motivation based on the rating scale. The survey provided insightful reasoning which promoted a conscious mindset for each participant. Even though participants were challenged to expose a deeper emotion about their connection to cross-country, it reminded them of their reasoning for beginning their journey. The limitations to the survey were the time frames that participants had available to complete the survey. Evans and Martha, 2005. Because of the significant differences in age and grade level that made up the team, many student athletes had different schedules and other responsibilities in their own life. Furthermore, participants were reminded to check their junk mail for their survey link, which added some delay to the research study. The lack of experience and expertise on the internet did cause some participants to experience troubleshooting instances. This research was conducted following the policies of the IRB of the University of La Verne. Permission was granted by the Director of Track and Field at the university. The instrument, entitled Sport Motivation Scale, was found on PsychTest database and aligns with the research by asking a series of questions relating to sport motivation. Demographics. The demographic information that stood out the most was the representation of ethnicity on the cross-country program. Of the 28%, 18 were either Hispanic, Latino, Spanish, or Latinx, representing 64% of the sample size. The next highest represented ethnicity was white or Caucasian, which resulted in 5 total participants of the sample size. Lastly, the third highest represented ethnicity was Black or African American, which resulted in 4 total participants of the sample size. Gender. Women resulted in 32% of the sample size, and men resulted in 68% of the sample size. Grade level. The most significant correlation was the first and second year percentage of the total sample size, which resulted in 46% of the sample size. Results. Intrinsic motivation attributes significantly correlated more with achieving peak performance than extrinsic motivation. The results indicated that 2 questions positively correlated with intrinsic motivations with p-values less than 0.05. Attributes relating to intrinsic motivation consisted of essence of sport and development of sport, which held a significant positive correlation to peak performance. In comparison, only 1 question correlated with extrinsic motivation with a p-value less than 0.05, which was self-doubt and can be correlated to the team's lack of experience. The findings are important because it proves the notion that student athletes and coaches are compelled to achieve a peak performance through intrinsic motivation rather than extrinsic motivation. The findings also highlighted the significance of creating a positive coaching environment through a process-oriented approach because of the correlation it has with intrinsic motivation experiences. Analysis. There is a positive correlation between intrinsic motivation and the sport of cross-country by examining the essence of student athletes and their coaches. There's also a positive correlation between intrinsic motivation and the developmental component of student athletes and coaches in a cross-country running setting. And lastly, there is a positive correlation between extrinsic motivation and the continuation of cross-country running. Recommendations. To improve the quality of data results, more participants added to the sample population would have established more credibility. Sheedick, 2018. The misrepresentation between student athletes and coaches made participation vital among every participant. Furthermore, the lack of flexibility of the overall sample population prevented the data collection to be completed in a timely manner. Having a more diverse group and larger sample population would have given the participants more time to complete the Sport Motivation Scale number 2 survey and expedited the data collection process. It is recommended for future studies to also have an entire team meeting beforehand to specify where to find the survey link and implement a time frame to ensure its completion. Conclusion. The data results prove the notion that intrinsic motivation had more positive correlations to achieving a peak performance than extrinsic motivation. Coaches must foster a positive team environment at practice to achieve peak performances during competition. Alamagro, 2018. As student athletes earn more experience through their cross-country career, self-doubt translates into self-confidence. Final thoughts. A quote that stuck with me throughout this entire capstone project was a quote by Kobe Bryant. It states, "Those times when you get up early and you work hard, those times when you stay up late and you work hard, those times when you don't feel like working, you're too tired, you don't want to push yourself, but you do it anyway, that is actually the dream. That's the dream." I appreciate everyone listening and viewing my presentation, and wish everyone the best of luck throughout their academic endeavors.